Hello everyone and welcome to the Literific's first Great Debate. My name is Matt Lee, I'm the president of the society here at Queen's. Tonight's debate is This House Regrets the Decriminalisation of Abortion in Northern Ireland. We've explained the rules to each individual speaker and they have agreed to compete in tonight's debate. I'd just like to start by thanking our guests and introducing them accordingly. So tonight we have joining us the Right Honourable Anne Widdecombe, former Shadow Home Secretary, Conservative MP and latterly Brexit Party MEP. Anne Furedi, Chief Executive Officer of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service and author of The Moral Case for Abortion. Peadar Tóibín, leader of On2, TD for Meath West since 2011, and who left Sinn Féin in 2018. Áine Groogan, Belfast City Councillor, Green Party member and pro-choice activist, and Ceri Dingle, Director of World Right and an author at Spiked, as well as Carla Lockhart, the DUP MP since 2019, and MLA for Upper Bann from 2016 to 2019, and who is a graduate of Ulster University. So thank you for all our guests for joining us. And I'd also like to thank our students participating in tonight's debate, Ben Cavan, Jodie Morrow, Mark Gilmore, Conor McArdle, as well, respectively. So thank you for joining us tonight. So with no further introduction, I'd like to start tonight's debate with our first speaker for the proposition to introduce the proposition's argument in tonight's debate, Ben Cavan. So Ben, thank you for joining us and please go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not a woman. I do not have a uterus. What I am is a human being, and what we have as human beings is a moral obligation to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves, in this case, the unborn child. We as the proposition tonight regret the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, namely the legislation that came into force last October after a long hiatus of the Northern Ireland Executive failing to meet and some of the most liberal abortion laws in Europe being put in place within Northern Ireland. Before I begin my speech, I would like to say a few disclaimers on behalf of the proposition tonight. Firstly, I and many of my fellow speakers are Christians, and while this influences our opinion on the debate, our reasoning behind our arguments will be based on science, as there is no direct link between being pro-life and being religious. Secondly, I want to say from the start that we as the proposition are aware of the sensitive nature of this issue, and as such, we are not here to judge or belittle any woman who has had or will have in the future an abortion. Instead, what we would like to do is to open your eyes to the reality of abortion and to undermine the pro-choice narrative that is spread throughout the world. In my speech, I would like to talk about the idea of the unborn child being alive, how some of the most common justifications for abortion are flawed, and finally, how there are suitable alternatives when a woman undergoes a crisis pregnancy. So first of all, the unborn child being alive. According to the Social Science Research Network, 95% of biologists in a study have said that life begins at conception. So according to science, the unborn child is more than just a clump of cells, as it is so often referred to. And indeed, I think on more than just a scientific level, but also on a human level, we know this to be true. Indeed, when a woman is pregnant and wants to keep her child, you would never on this earth hear her refer to it as the clump of cells inside of her. No, instead you would hear her refer to it as the life inside of her, because we all know that it is alive. And as such, if the unborn child is alive, which it objectively is, we can then regret the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, because I heard a lot of talk about human rights this week, but I'm drawn to the Article 2, right to life, and it is clear that the unborn child is alive and is deserving of that life. I'll now move on to some of the most common justifications for abortion and how they are flawed. So an overarching theme for justifying abortion is the idea of autonomy. And before I look more specifically at three main justifications, namely mental health, rape, and the life of the woman being in danger for time's sake, I would like to make an overarching point. Indeed, the idea of autonomy is so often used by those of the pro-choice persuasion as a justification for abortion. However, there are other stages of pregnancy in which the idea of autonomy is not used. Take when a woman is told she shouldn't drink or undergo other activities while pregnant, the justification for this being that the woman does not want to harm her child. The idea of autonomy is not used here, even though these things undermine the liberty of the woman. Same with abortion, and even more so should there be limits put in place to prevent harm to the child. I'll now look more specifically at the idea of mental health being a justification for abortion. So according to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, which carries out research for pro-choice organisations like Planned Parenthood, only 7% of abortions take place for what we would call the hard cases, things like rape or the woman's life being in danger. And so over 90% of abortions are carried out for mental health reasons. And this reasoning is, according to the evidence, flawed. In 1992, the Journal of Social Issues in Australia wrote that, quote, there is virtually no disagreement that women experience negative psychological reactions post-abortion. And this is concurred between pro-life and pro-choice scientists, including the likes of Goldstein. And indeed, of these women, 38% of women who undergo abortion, in fact, suffer clinical mental disorders like PTSD following their abortion. And that's according to the Task Force on Mental Health. And that same article that I've just referred to even goes as far as to say, quote, there are no findings of mental health benefits associated with abortion. And as I've stated, over 90% of cases of abortion are for this reason. And if this is the main reason for abortion, and if the evidence suggests it is flawed, then of course we are to regret the decriminalisation of abortion because it is based off a false premise, namely mental health. I will now move on to another justification for abortion, and that is the issue of rape. So Dr. Callum Miller, who is a medical graduate of Oxford, said that 60% of women who are raped were happy for having kept their child. It is not the rape that lowers their mental health, but it is the societal stigma of keeping a baby after being raped. As indeed, as a fundamental level, this is because it is not the child who is responsible for the abhorrence of rape. I can't stand here and say that I'll ever know what it feels like to be raped. Of course, I'm not stupid and would say something so abhorrent. However, what I do know is that, as has been shown through evidence, abortion lowers the mental health of the woman. And so having an abortion would not get rid of the trauma, but would merely add a further trauma following the rape. I'll finally move on now to the life of the woman being at risk. And I think this doesn't need considered in as much detail, as this was already legal in Northern Ireland before decriminalisation of abortion in October. But I think, very briefly, I want to say, last year in the UK, there was something between 1 and 100 women who had abortions due to their life being at risk. This is due to advancements of medicine. And as a matter of policy, no law should be based upon extreme cases and should be based upon the majority. And as I have said, according to the evidence, majority of cases are carried out under the false premise that abortion helps the mental health of the woman. I shall now look to the alternatives when a woman undergoes a crisis pregnancy. So often, pro-choice people would say, rather unsubstantiated, I might add, that those of the pro-life persuasion only care about those within the womb. However, those who are pro-life should care also for those outside the womb and those in the adoption agency particularly. And adoption, again, is so often belittled and slandered by those of the pro-choice persuasion who say that it's an ineffective system and leads to more hardships. However, last year, studies in England showed that 88% of children who were in the adoption system were adopted by parents, 88%. And for those 12% that were not adopted and couldn't find a family, my heart goes out to them, and I would personally like to fund the adoption agency to further that number. But it does show that the adoption agency is effective. And so to say that children will have a worse chance of life if they're put in the adoption agency is completely flawed. Moreover, I think it's important that those of the pro-life persuasion fund crisis pregnancy help centres so as women can have counselling on these issues, and so that women aren't told this false narrative that abortion will be the answer to all their problems. Indeed, we as the proposition regret the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, as the child is alive, as the main justifications for abortion are flawed, and there are viable alternatives out there. And indeed, when looking at Northern Ireland, it is possible to abort certain societal groups right up to birth. Take those with Down syndrome, for example. And in the words of Ben Shapiro from America, he says that the day before terminating a pregnancy for birth, this is the choice, but on the day of birth, it is seen as first-degree murder. And I think that's really telling, those words tonight. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very emotive issue. And when you look at it from a human standpoint, initially, I think we're all drawn to side with the woman always in these cases. And I think I would have done so too. But on looking at the evidence, I think it's important for us to leave aside our presuppositions in this debate tonight, to not see this as a contest between the rights of the woman and the rights of the child, but instead to see that abortion is a flawed industry, that there are viable alternatives which will take the mental health of the woman into account. And so I really challenge the opposition tonight to not make this a battle of women's rights, but to also take into account the scientific and human objective evidence that the child is alive, and as such to address that point, because no life should be taken away. We all had the chance for life, and so the unborn child should also have the chance for life. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote with the proposition tonight in regretting the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, and to look out from our moral obligation to the unborn child. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for your introduction to the debate tonight for the proposition. And now it turns to Jodie Morrow to introduce the argument for the opposition in tonight's debate. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I was struggling with the camera there. Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to all the speakers who are here tonight. I'm absolutely starstruck to be speaking with everyone tonight. So just give me a minute to settle myself because I'm really excited. So this has been an issue really close to my heart for forever. I've done about abortion in my A-level art project. I've studied it to debate on it in previous situations. I actually went to school in Banbridge, where I know Carla is a representative. So this is a really interesting debate to be had. So I'd like to introduce myself before I start, because I know I'm not as well known as all the speakers here tonight. So I'm 19 years old, and the first time that I heard abortion being discussed was actually in Banbridge Academy when we debated it in religious studies. At that point, I was arguing against it from a Christian standpoint. I believed it was only acceptable in cases of rape, incest, and fatal fetal abnormality. Which is exactly what my mum believes, and that's because that was my only exposure to the subject back then. So it's crucial we have these debates because we need to open ourselves up to all the different circumstances. So Ben was talking about the PTSD caused by abortions. So whenever we're talking about the cases of rape, I think it's important to highlight that 75% of rape victims experience PTSD anyway. So to try and say that the abortion is what caused the PTSD would be questionable at best. I think it's important to talk about the science of it. He's very right. So I'm going to bring up the World Health Organization, who gave out the statistics saying that highly restrictive abortion laws are not associated with lower abortion rates. So as the motion is the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, we have to look at the legality. We have to look at the practical implications of legalisation versus criminalisation. So regardless of if we believe that abortion is morally right, morally just, if the baby's alive, whatever, these are not relevant to talking about decriminalising it. Whenever abortion is more restrictive, the World Health Organization found that that abortion was more common and typically more unsafe. So across the
On
world,
that
globally, sorry,
on that point,
go for it.
so I take your point in here about, I guess, to go into the idea of backstreet abortions, but there was a pro-choice scientist called Briggs, I forget her first name, and she did what you call the turnaway study, which was basically women who were refused abortion in restrictive abortion states, and she found that almost all the women in that study kept their baby rather than looking to a backstreet termination. So what say you to that?
I say that it's quite sad that women were stripped of their choice in that situation. I think that means that those women could have been put into even greater hardships, and I think that it's disgusting to think that them not having a choice is the right way to go. I don't think any woman should be forced into carrying a baby full term. The truth of the matter is that 121 million pregnancies every year are unwanted, and 6 out of 10 of all of these pregnancies end in abortion. Despite what Ben has just said, I believe that whenever a woman wants an abortion, it's generally her mind is set on it, because it is always a last resort. Abortion is not something that any woman wants to use as a contraceptive. There's this narrative that women will abuse it and will use it as if we're lazy and we're just going to start having sex and getting pregnant and just going and getting abortion. That's so not true. You know, in Northern Ireland, we have access to contraceptives, we have access to protection. Unfortunately, in Northern Ireland, people in my generation have still been brought up with an abstinence-only sex education, not in my school, but I have spoken to people in particularly religious areas where their sex education was entirely limited to just waiting till marriage, which we all know is entirely associated with increased unwanted pregnancies. So Northern Ireland, unfortunately, is always about 30 years behind everything else, and it's not surprising that our government failed to actually implement the laws itself. I don't believe we should regret the decriminalisation of abortion. I believe we should regret that our government were not the ones to step up and fight for women's rights. I think it's a disgrace that our government put their petty feuds, as always, in front of everything that their people were fighting for. But when we look at it, Westminster stepped in for a reason. They stepped in because it has been found that access to abortion is a basic human right to women. You can argue that some people believe that we should fight for the basic human rights of a child. However, I believe we need to fight for those who are born. And unfortunately, our world is not perfect, and there are still many difficult circumstances which lead to women seeking abortions. And until we have created a safer world where abortion is not as frequently used, where we seek out every alternative first, then we have to focus on the woman first before the child. To me, the woman is always the first priority. That's just my view on it. So the thing about the motion being about Northern Ireland specifically as well, I think we have to talk about Northern Ireland specific cases. So we're a very small country. We all know each other. So everyone knows somebody who knows someone who's had an abortion, who has sought an abortion, who's had a mysterious trip to England. We all know these people. My family, we're very close with Sarah Yurt's family. I went on holidays with her granda, who helped her go over to England to get an abortion for her pregnancy. She was late term abortion because of fetal abnormality. The skull hadn't formed properly. She wanted a child. Not all pregnancies that end in abortion were unwanted pregnancies, and we have to remember this typical woman who wants an abortion, this whole narrative of women who just are careless and didn't think about everything and have ended up in a situation they don't want to be in. It's not always true. These women sometimes want a child. They may want a child, but not right now. You know, these women are not just innately not maternal. So on that point, I think we need to focus on the women being capable of making decisions for their own bodies, for knowing what their situation is best suited to. We could go through every individual case. You can look at every woman who regretted an abortion and every woman who thought it was the best thing that they could have possibly done in that situation. We can go through every woman who was happy they got 2 minutes with their child and every woman who was traumatized by having to carry a child with a fetal abnormality. We can go through every child who was stripped of their, or every woman who was stripped of their child in Ireland during the the laundries. And we can go through every historical event and we can go through every present day case. we all have different experiences with abortion. Every woman experiences it differently. Every woman will go through it differently. But what we need to do is, legally, we have to look at this from the perspective of who is best capable of making that decision. Is it someone? No, thanks. I personally believe that every woman and her doctor are the people who are best equipped to make that decision in that situation. Because we can all sit here and we can discuss every different scenario, every little intricacy that's going to vary. However, until we can, we're not all going to be able to agree. So we need to be able to have laws that will accommodate every possible scenario. And all of the statistics, unfortunately, point to restrictive abortion laws only increasing the likelihood of abortions being sought out. So I think it's very important that we don't underestimate the importance of supporting women in access to safe legal abortions, because at the end of the day, it could prevent more deaths, because approximately 13% of all maternal deaths every year are a result of unsafe abortions. So they are still happening. They are still very prevalent, particularly in developing countries. Northern Ireland, thankfully, it's not as common. However, our government did vote against prescribing abortion pills over the phone, even during coronavirus, and preventing them access to pills whenever they're maybe isolating, etc. So unfortunately, I do regret our government's attitude to this issue. We're constantly fighting for this right. Our government is still pushing back. Arlene Foster said that this law change was retroactive, whilst I would argue that constantly fighting against what Northern Ireland wants, because in 2018 we did a poll and 65% of our population believed that we should have decriminalised abortion at the same time as repeal the 8th. So we may not have had a chance to voice our opinion then, and our government might not have been the ones to enact the laws, but we're here tonight to actually voice the sides of both arguments and prove that there are people in support of access to abortion. We can all disagree on the intricacies of the laws, about what weeks we go up to, etc. However, in terms of just decriminalise it or not, decriminalisation is associated with less abortions being sought, with safer abortions, with better mental health, with a more progressive society, with better overall situations for everyone involved. So thank you all for listening. Please, I would urge you to vote for the opposition and not regret the decriminalisation of abortion. This is a progressive move for our society, not a retroactive one. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jodie, for that speech. Now it turns to me to introduce the second speaker for the proposition, the Right Honourable Anne Widdecombe.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Can I congratulate Ben on what I thought was an excellent opening speech? And I would like to begin with a point that he finished with, which is this. When a child is born, you cannot take its life. Not 1 minute after birth can you take its life. It does not matter how disabled that child is, how profoundly sick it may be, how stressed the mother is, how poor the mother is, whether the mother has suddenly decided that she didn't after all want to have the child. You cannot take that child's life. At the moment of birth, it has full civil rights. It is protected as much as you and I are protected by the law. Yet, 1 day earlier, that is not so. But hang on, it's the same child. Nothing has happened in previous days or previous weeks. Nothing has happened to change that child into something different, other than the fact that finally it can be seen that it is quite visibly here among us. But it's been here among us in the days and the weeks and indeed the months before that birth. So I would say that the law, which has now been imposed, I can't put it any other way, on Northern Ireland, is a law that actually is illogical, it is immoral, and it is unkind. If a child can enjoy our protection 1 day, that same child should be able to enjoy our protection the day before. You have two babies of exactly the same age and gestation, let's say 23 weeks. In one case, that child has been born prematurely and is having all the resources of medical science poured into trying to save it as it lies in a cot surrounded by technology, everybody fighting for its life. Another child of exactly the same age and gestation, the mother has decided not to have it, and that same child, whom we cannot see, of course, all that child's future is not a cot surrounded by medics fighting for its life, but all the future that child will face is the black sack and the flames. Now, to me, there is a profound immorality about that. It certainly defies all logic if you want to apply cold logic to it, and it is hardly kind to the 23-year-old baby that could be saved, but is being deliberately discarded. And I say again that the big difference is be seen and unseen. If we could see the unborn children that were being taken into the abortion clinics, there would probably be a public uprising, but we can't see them. They're concealed. And so it's easy to pretend that they aren't actually here among us. So the big question is, if we are obliged to protect life, I believe we are, then where does life begin? Where do we start saying at this point, this child has full civil rights? You cannot discriminate on grounds of disability. You cannot discriminate on any grounds at all, because this child has full civil rights at a certain point. And what is that point? Well, some people will say, as we know, that it's at birth itself, but I hope that I've just demonstrated that's illogical and immoral. Others would say, no, not at birth itself, but when it's capable of surviving independently outside the womb, at that point, we can call it life. But of course, that point itself is disputed. Is it 22, 23, 24, 25 weeks? A lot of scientific discussion around it. And what exactly, again, is the logic or the morality of saying, okay, we'll protect a child that is 24 weeks and 1 day, but we won't protect a child that is 23 weeks and 6 days. Okay, well, maybe it's not then when it can live independently. Maybe it's 18 weeks. 18 weeks was the choice of the pro-life movement in Britain at the end of the 1980s. We knew we couldn't get no weeks. What did we go for? We went for 18 weeks. Why? Because by 18 weeks, the child in the womb is fully developed, and all that needs to occur for that child to survive is growth. Could not be taken from the womb and could not survive at 18 weeks, but it is fully developed. You look at the picture of a child in the womb at 18 weeks, a photograph of it, it is perfectly recognizable as a baby. It has everything. So perhaps we should say, well, 18 weeks, and then others will say, well, no, not 18 weeks. What about 12 weeks? Because at 12 weeks, the child is kicking, even if you can't feel it. And at 12 weeks, it's got absolutely everything. It's got toes, it's got eyelids, it's got absolutely every last thing. And it is quite recognizably a baby. And so it goes on. Now, once you start trying to pick a point at which life begins, there will always be a counter argument that actually life begins at a completely different point, because all those criteria that we've looked at are purely arbitrary. They have no root in anything except an arbitrary decision. Oh, well, it's at this point, it's at that point. And that is why I believe passionately, and have always believed, and I also am a Christian and a Catholic, but even as an agnostic, I believed passionately and debated passionately during those years in favour of recognising and protecting life. Now, the unborn child has no voice except the law. Once the mother has decided that child is not going to be born, the only thing that will protect that child is the law, and therefore it is appropriate. Some people argue it's not appropriate for the law to be involved. You know, it must always be a woman's sole choice. No, the law is the only voice which the unborn child has. And therefore, I think it right that the law should intervene in abortion. Now, when a baby's miscarried, we never say the fetus has miscarried, never say that. Yet a child of the same age who hasn't been miscarried, but who's been deliberately aborted, you say it's a fetus. We've taken the fetus away. We don't say we've taken the baby away. And yet they are exactly the same. They're exactly the same gestation. They look the same in the womb. We can't, of course, see them. And again, I come back to that point. Now, I believe that's why in just about every opinion poll that was ever done before Westminster decided to step in and tell Northern Ireland what it should be doing in its own country, 58% of Sinn Féin voters did not want that law, and 54% of DUP voters did not want that law, and only 5% wanted it to stretch to 20 weeks. That seemed shockingly long. But I think it is right that we ask ourselves, what should we be doing apart from passing law? And this is where I much admire Ben's point about social care of babies and their mothers. And that's why I'm very proud indeed to be a patron of the Life movement, which actually provides accommodation for mothers who are going to find it difficult to carry on with a pregnancy in the situation that they're in. They might be living at home and the parents don't want it, or whatever the case may be. They provide accommodation, they provide support, and they provide support not only throughout the pregnancy, but afterwards, crucially, afterwards. And children spend the early part of their infancy in those homes if that's what's required. And I had such a house, Life House, in my constituency. And when it was celebrating its 21st birthday, I went back there. And of course, by then, some of the children who had been born there were themselves mothers or about to be mothers. And they all said the same thing. Their lives, the children's lives, had been saved by the Life movement. And the mothers all said the same thing. Their sanity had been saved by the Life movement. So I don't believe for one moment that anybody in this world, male, female, anything, has an arbitrary right of deciding when another being can or can't live. That right does not exist. There is one exception I would make. I think that the only circumstances in which you take life are in order to save life. And if the mother is really going to die, then I have no problem with saying that at that stage, the law should not lay down one outcome or the other. But that doesn't usually happen until very late in pregnancy. And when that happens late in pregnancy, it is more than possible to terminate the pregnancy while trying to save the child as well as the mother. It is not necessary to carry out an abortion, which is the ending of the child's life. An early termination can be carried out. And I think that where that is possible, that always should be. So I do not believe that it is logical, as I say, that it's moral, certainly isn't moral to take life. And it isn't kind to simply distinguish between two children of exactly the same age, exactly the same gestation, exactly the same state of health, whatever it may be, to distinguish between them purely on the grounds of another being's wish. And so I strongly support this proposition, and I look forward to the rest of the debate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Anne, for that speech. And now it turns to me to introduce the second speaker for the opposition, Anne Furedi. Thank you.
First of all, let me say thank you very much for the introductions that have been given, which have been absolutely excellent, and mostly to the organisers of this debate for putting it on, because I think it's absolutely essential that on these very contested issues, we get the opportunity to arguments and to share our different views and to debate them. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of that. I have to say that there is one thing that I do regret about the decriminalisation of the law in the abortion law in Northern Ireland, and that is that I regret the way that it came about. I do think that it would have been better, and I mean, Anne alluded to this, if the changes of the law in Northern Ireland had been subject to a full discussion and democratic vote by the people of that nation. I think it's important that the way that the law was changed in the Republic of Ireland very much reflected and was brought about by the people who were in that particular nation. And I think that it's always best when legal change is brought about by the people of a particular nation. But then again, having said that, I regret the way that the change was made, there is nothing that I regret about the circumstance of the law that now exists. And I can say that while I actually agree with many used into the discussion, I have to say that personally, I too believe that life begins at conception. I think that the embryo, however early in its gestation, is a mind being that, as human in terms of its species being, it is absolutely deserving of our value and our respect. And I do think that our law acknowledges that. And I think that it's important that we give humanity and human beings the status that we know that they deserve. They are indeed one of us in that respect. And I can understand Anne's consternation, and indeed the consternation of people who look at the circumstances of late abortion and make the point that a fetus late in pregnancy is the equivalent in many ways of a baby that has been born at the same gestation. And I think that Anne is exactly right when she says that if you look at a 36-week-old fetus in utero and you look at a 36-week-old baby that has been born, there is absolutely nothing that is different in the fetus or the baby. And even those of us who provide abortions will often refer to babies. There's no great difference except for the geography. One is inside the woman and one is not inside the woman anymore. And as Anne rightly points out, the one that is not inside the woman can be surrounded by other people other than that. The real problem that we have is, and where the issue really rests for me, is not about the care of the infant or the baby or the fetus. While I acknowledge that in some ways appears to be the sympathetic party in this discussion with whom we should emphasize, for me, a far greater importance and a far greater value becomes attached to the woman, because there the difference is absolutely everything. The difference between the baby being inside her, where any intervention is an intervention on her, any decision not affect unborn baby, let's call it, but also affect herself, is very, very different from the decisions that can be taken about a baby that's born. And the reason why I feel so strongly about the autonomy and the bodily integrity of that individual woman is because I believe that one thing that is as important as the sanctity of life is the principle that we are sovereigns of our own bodies, and
on that point,
no, I'm going to move on, cannot be commanded to use our bodies in a way that we don't agree with. There may be moral issues that you disagree with, but this principle that our bodies are our own is vitally important. It's one of the things that protects us against, for example, the harvesting of organs. If you take my kidneys, if you take my lungs, if you take my eyes and my heart, I could keep alive and benefit the lives of many other born and living people, but you can't do that because of the sanctity of your own body. I have a very special kind of blood. Not only am I O negative, but I have what's known as baby blood. I'm free from certain kind of antibodies, which basically means that my blood, I'm one of very few people whose blood can be used to save the lives of newborn neonates and of cancer patients, people who are immunosuppressed. I give blood, I give life to those people out of a moral commitment, but there is no law that says that I must do that. And I think it's right that there is no law that compels me to do that. So looking ahead then at the law and of the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, the law that criminalised abortion in Northern Ireland was a 19th century law that was passed to protect the lives of women when abortion was very dangerous. In 1967, in England and Wales and in Scotland, a different law was introduced that allowed doctors to carry out abortions when women met certain criteria. And that law, the Abortion Act of 1967, was never introduced in Northern Ireland. And that was a decision that was made at that particular time. But when you look now at the modern circumstances in which abortion is provided, abortion is not nor is a procedure that causes great mental distress to the women. Yes, of course you will have women who regret their decision, but BPAS, the organisation that I run, provides 80,000 abortions a year. And the number of those abortions that we think are regretted are very few. And the number of women who are entirely grateful and continue to believe that that abortion was the right thing for them and their family is very large. And the women who have those abortions with us are not feckless teenagers or people who don't know how contraception works or what it is. The majority of women are mothers already. Because you see, Anne, they have abortions not because they don't know what is growing inside their womb, but because they do know what it takes to raise a child. And they take the decision to end the pregnancy because morally they think, according to their conscience, it is the right thing to do. I believe that abortion is a deeply moral issue. And I think that moral decision has to be left to the conscience of the person who is closest to it. And that's the conscience of the doctor, who I believe should never be forced to do an abortion that they do not feel that they can in good conscience carry out. And to the woman who ultimately will live with the decision for the rest of her life. And that is why I believe that a decriminalised abortion situation is the right and, importantly, the responsibility for that moral decision where it rests, which is on the woman. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Anne, for that speech, and sorry for some technical difficulties that we were having there. I think there was a bit of a relay there, so I apologise for that, but thank you for your speech and your contribution here tonight. And now I go to the third speaker for the proposition, Peadar Tóibín TD. Thank you.
Gurb Mila Mahagat at Uachtaráin. I appreciate greatly the opportunity to speak with you here tonight. Just to introduce people to who we are, I'm the leader of Ireland's newest political movement, AIM 2. We are a left of centre, United Ireland human rights political party. I was with Sinn Féin for a period of about 22 years, but that political party flipped its views very quickly on the issue of the rights to life. And many of us had no choice but to leave. Now, it's a shocking thing to say that AIM 2 is the only nationalist Republican political party on the whole island of Ireland who simply believes that everybody should have the right to life. It's an incredible thing, the idea that every single human individual should have the right to life. Now, obviously, we think that this debate is one of the most important debates in a generation. And it's the first most important thing is that the unborn child is a living individual human being. Now, the fact that we as adults in 2020 are having a debate on whether it's right or wrong to take the life of an individual living human being is still mind-blowing in my mind. It's an incredible situation. And individual living human being, many on the pro-abortion side, will either, contradict that scientific fact or they'll try to ignore it as well. We also know that the unborn child is the most vulnerable of all human beings. And I think with modern technology, people have got to know far better unborn children. So most people meet their child for the first time at the 12-week scan. Most people have a photograph in their homes at the moment of their children, the first photograph at the 12-week scan. Yet in the south of Ireland at the moment, you can legally end the rights that you can end that child's life for any reason whatsoever. We also know that, I suppose, human life is the most important thing that anybody has. Without it, we have nothing. And remember that an abortion, is literally the end of the world for that individual baby boy or baby girl. We approach this, to be honest, on a human rights basis. We believe, that every living human being, by definition, should have human rights. And human rights, by definition, are universal. If you remove one section of humanity from a human right, it's not actually a human right anymore. It's a sectional right. Right. So if you don't believe that unborn children should have the human right to life, well then, by definition, you're stating that the right to life isn't a human right. I'd also want to say that it's important that we look at the effect of legislating, because this particular motion talks about regretting its introduction into the north of Ireland. Now, one of your speakers earlier mentioned, that there's no real change if you allow for abortion in the north of Ireland. It's simply displacing abortions that were happening in Britain and allowing them to happen in the north of Ireland. In any single jurisdiction you look at where there has been an introduction in abortion, the numbers radically increase. And so, for example, in the south of Ireland, and these are figures that were given by the pro-abortion lobby before the referendum, we had about 4,500 abortions. Now, those abortions numbers in the first year of legalization after the referendum went up to 6,666. There was an increase of 40% in 1 year. So the abortion rate was falling in the south of Ireland for 18 years. It's legalized and it spikes by 40%. And that happened in Scotland when it was legalized. It happens in so many other jurisdictions as well. So remember, because that law was introduced in the south of Ireland, there are 2,200 missing people in the south of Ireland. These people would be alive, they'll be here, they'll be in existence, they'll be in their first year of life, only for that piece of legislation that was introduced. And it's the same in the north of Ireland. And remember as well, we often hear and I think it's disingenuous when some people on the pro-choice side argue about this. In the south, the statistics show 98.2% of the abortions that took place last year were healthy mothers and healthy babies. And every time we get into these discussions, people on the other side of the debate only want to talk about the 1.8% of those figures. The 98.2% are consistently ignored by commentators on this issue. So there's a radical difference in the number of abortions that happen in Ireland, north and south, compared to what is happening in Britain. In Britain, 4 out of every 20 pregnancies are ended. The lives are ended. In Ireland, north and south, before the laws were introduced, it was 1 in every 20. So 3 extra lives made it to full term in the south and in the north before the importation of these British laws and culture as well. And I just want to say is sometimes people mistake abortion for being progressive. Now, I don't know how you can make an argument for one person's lives being ended and that being progress in any way. But one of the major difficulties Áine too has with regards to abortion is the effect that it has on minorities. So if you're from a minority sector of society, you're far more likely to be aborted. Now, there's an organization in Britain called Don't Screen Us Out. Some of you might have heard it. It's an organization that's created by people with disabilities to ask people to stop aborting people with disabilities. Now think about that. We have in 2020 again, people with disabilities creating organizations to ask society to stop aborting people like themselves. It's an incredible situation. So in other European countries, we have abortion rates of 90% or more of unborn children with certain disabilities. So certain individuals with disabilities are not making it to term, and they reckon in some countries in Europe, you're not going to have any children born in future, except by accident, who have certain disabilities. And there was a health minister in the Netherlands who stated, and this is a quote from her, "If freedom of choice results in a situation where no children with Down syndrome are being born, society must accept that." Where in God's name is the progress for a situation where we eradicate a whole sector of society from us? You know, and for individuals obviously concerned, the unborn children with those disabilities, that's catastrophic, obviously. But as a society, we are much poorer if we delete the diversity of humanity from around us. People talk about life-limiting disabilities, and obviously, you know, life-limiting disabilities are fatal fetal abnormalities. Is a very, very tough diagnosis for any family to get. I have asked doctors all over Ireland, is it possible for a doctor to declare without a shadow of a doubt that an unborn child would not make it to birth outside of the womb if that child is diagnosed to have a life-limiting disability? And every single doctor says it's not possible. And actually in the South, and you won't hear about it this much, there has been cases where much wanted children were diagnosed as having a fatal fetal abnormality. The unborn child was aborted, and they found out after the abortion that the child was fully healthy. And those parents are now fighting with these hospitals for investigations into why they lost their child. In the North, in the law that is in the North at the moment, there's actually two sets of rights. If you're able-bodied, you have a different time limit to if you have a disability. That's the polar opposite of what equality means. The idea of gender selection abortion, and people may not have heard this, but it's estimated that there are 100 million missing women in the world due to gender selection abortion or infanticide. Now, in the debates that happened in the South, many of them led by feminists on the pro-abortion side, not once was the issue of gender selection abortion ever mentioned. And I note your previous speaker, Anne Furedi, has argued on television for the right to allow for gender selection abortion. She believes, and I hope I'm not misquoting her, and I welcome her to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I understand she believes that it should be the right to have an abortion on the basis of that child being female. In countries such as China and Britain and the US, you know, for economic, social, and cultural reasons, baby sons are kept and baby girls aren't, and that's leading to massive difficulties within society. In other countries, like in Scotland and America, they found out that if you're from an ethnic minority, you're more likely to be aborted. In New York City, and this is startling, more African American babies are aborted than are actually born. It's an incredible situation. So in a society where rightly we argue that, you know, Black lives matter, the biggest threat to Black lives in the state, the US, is actually abortion at the moment. Abortion also discriminates against poor people. If you're in the US, you are far more likely to be aborted if you're from a poor family. 75% of all unborn children aborted in the US come from low income backgrounds. If you're rich, you're far more likely to make it to full term. You know, I believe, you know, if a government really wants to help women, targeted funding to help lift families out of poverty, along with childcare and the decent living wage, they're the types of issues that lift mothers out of poverty and give real choice. It's interesting that the Tories brought this in from London into the north of Ireland, and in the south, Fine Gael introduced this in the south. There are two political parties that are not giving, economic choices to mothers, never mind any other choices at all. I hear people talk about the rights to bodily autonomy, and yet argue for one body of an individual living human being has the right to be destroyed. That's an incredible argument. If you believe in bodily autonomy, well, then bodily autonomy has to be universal as well. And, there's a funny thing, we're talking about autonomy every day these days around COVID. Most people realize that their individual autonomy can be restricted at some level. Why? To save the lives of the most vulnerable. That's the logic of most countries' campaigns currently. I and Aine believe very strongly that we are all responsible for each other, no matter how frail, how vulnerable. We live under the same sky. We have to fight right through society to protect all mothers and all children.
Thank you, Peadar. Thank you, Peadar, for that contribution and your speech in the debate tonight. Now I turn to Ceri Dingle to continue the case as the third speaker for the opposition. Thank you, Ceri.
For some reason, my camera has just failed, and I've been trying to make it work again. But can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and that'd be brilliant. Are you okay to speak now then?
Yes, I'm really sorry that you can't see me. I don't understand why it's just failed.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you, Ceri Dingle, to continue as the third speaker for the opposition. Thank you.
I'm sorry that I'm a blank screen. I do apologise. I run an education charity called World Right, and we run what's called Citizen TV. And in fact, which relates directly to this debate, we're very passionate about citizenship, about democracy, about freedom, and about equality. And it's for that reason I want to argue that we certainly shouldn't recriminalise abortion, precisely because this is about living in a civilised society. And it's my belief that abortion should be provided to women under the law and in practice as early as possible and as late as necessary. In fact, I don't think there should be a law on abortion over and above a law which regulates medical procedures. It should be for women to decide what is best for them. In other words, to choose. And I would ask you to consider, and especially the student population, who I have to commend, and I commend your university for holding this debate, because too few people are even prepared to take part in this debate, which I think is disastrous and very tragic. But I would ask you to consider, is it better to force a woman who doesn't want and doesn't feel she can raise a child to go through with an unwanted pregnancy, or is it better to enable her to live her life in a way that she sees fit? Because let's face it, life is messy, sex is messy, sexual relationships are messy, and we know that unplanned pregnancy is a fact of life for women. Contraception can and does fail, accidents happen all the time. And women don't think, oh, it's all right, I'll just get an abortion. No one ever chooses a painful option if they can avoid it. But women do get into this situation. I've been in this situation, and it is awful for women concerned who are terrified about who they can tell, fearful of their future, at the mercy of the law, fearful even of going to prison if they can't face going through with an unwanted pregnancy. So if we ask ourselves, what is the best way forward for people who find themselves in that situation, I would argue all of us in this discussion and in this debate, we can't know that. We don't know what's best for that woman. Only that woman can know. And it has for that woman to decide. I'm sorry, I'm carrying on. We can't decide in advance what would be best for that young woman or for an older woman and for her family. They have to decide that. And if you think about your own situation as a student, and I work with a lot of teenagers and students, university students, if you think about that situation, having to maybe give up university, being forced into having a baby against your will, is that what you want to do to your peers and your friends? Ruin their lives because you don't feel comfortable with abortion? You know, who are even these scientists to decide for that woman that she must be forced into having a baby against her will? And in fact, lots of people who go on and on about ignorant young women getting pregnant. In fact, if we look at the facts, more than 50% of abortions are provided to women who already have a family, who feel they just can't cope with any more. Is it your place? Is it my place? Is it our place to decide for them? What if later in life, this is you as a student and your family? Do you want to control your life, or are you going to hand that decision over to lawyers and politicians and the state and people who have a different opinion to you? And I think we also have to consider what's best for a society in which we are not going to agree on this. You know, people hold very different views. You know, great conviction, like, you know, Anne Widdecombe, great conviction, like Anne Furedi, in advancing the rights and freedom of women, have very different views, because I don't think we're going to reach a position where Anne and Anne will agree, where everybody is going to hold the same view on this particular question between different faiths. And therefore, I think there is only one civilized way forward, and that is for society to respect the views and choices of other people and leave it to them, for individual women to decide what is best for them. Not the state, not the doctors, not us, not you, but if you're stuck yourself, being able to make that decision to choose. I think that is the consistently civilized position to take. We can respect other people's views we disagree with. We have to allow them their life decisions. That is progress. That is what has taken us out of the dark ages and allowed women to control their fertility, to decide when they want to have a family, and to move forward on that basis. And I would strongly urge a vote against this motion for women to make the choices that are best for themselves. That's it.
Thank you, Ceri, for being here tonight, and thank you for your speech to the society. So now it turns to me to introduce the fourth speaker for the proposition to continue the proposition's argument in tonight's debate, Carla Lockhart MP. Thank you.
Forgot to unmute there. Thank you very much, and can I thank everyone for organising this debate. I have found it very informative, and I suppose in truth I never fail to be shocked by some of the arguments around women's rights, and yet they don't take into awareness the rights of the unborn, and that both lives matter in every decision that is made. Let me begin with a number: 100,000. A rigorous piece of research validated by the Advertising Standards Authority found in 2017 that around 100,000 men and women are alive today in Northern Ireland who would not be had we embraced the 1967 Abortion Act. 100,000 brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, friends who are alive today because we, the people of Northern Ireland, had our own distinctive voice, and our voice was heard, choosing to celebrate and protect life in the womb. In this context, it is no great surprise that Northern Ireland's devolved life-affirming laws, which only allowed for abortion in tightly defined circumstances, should have been regarded as a matter of pride by many people in the province. Moreover, regardless of their view on the issue, Polling in Northern Ireland adults from 2018 demonstrated that 64% of people in Northern Ireland thought it would be wrong for Westminster to seek to impose any change on Northern Ireland's abortion laws. In this context, it is no surprise when on the 9th of July 2019 there was an attempt to impose radical abortion law change on Northern Ireland, that 100% of Northern Ireland MPs who take their seats voted against a change in the law. It was, however, absolutely appalling that MPs from England, Wales and Scotland who were not elected to represent Northern Ireland were content to disenfranchise the people of Northern Ireland to vote to silence the voices of their representatives on a matter that not only pertained narrowly to Northern Ireland, but which was also devolved. This set a most disturbing precedent. It appalled me then and it appalls me now. The views of the women and men of Northern Ireland are not monolithic on the issue, but the beauty of democracy is that every person has a right to be heard. In the consultation on the new regulations governing abortion in Northern Ireland, 79% of the 21,000 responses rejected the proposals set forward. In votes on these regulations in the Assembly, the place where representatives of the people of Northern Ireland act on our behalf, the will of that House made it very clear when in 2 votes, 75 out of 90 MLAs voted against allowing abortion on the basis of disability. Yet when those same regulations were put before politicians in Westminster shortly afterwards, these votes by the devolved Assembly on a matter that remained and remains devolved were completely ignored as Westminster voted to impose a significantly more permissive abortion law on Northern Ireland than pertains to the rest of the UK. Yes, that's right. Our regime is more permissive, allowing abortion for any reason, including the sex of the fetus, up to 12 weeks, something that is not lawful in any other part of the UK. It is, of course, as permissive as the rest of the UK in other respects, in that it allows for abortion on demand on the same basis as in GB to 24 weeks and to birth in cases of disability as in GB. Some have said that CEDAW required this dramatic policy shift, but I would remind each of us here today that the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women nowhere mentions abortion. In a 2017 Supreme Court judgment, the justices conclude that there is no human right in the international law to access an abortion. I quote, "The conventions and the covenant to which the UK is part carefully stop short of calling upon national authorities to make abortion services generally available." The judgment also made it clear that the recommendations of the UN committee were not binding, saying some of the committees go further down that path, but as a member of international law, the authority of their recommendations is slight. Today, let me say clearly that I regret that instead of listening to the overwhelming majority of voices of the people of Northern Ireland, politicians in Westminster chose to bow to the will of an unelected committee, the authority of whose recommendations are slight. What adds immeasurably to my regret that the voice of the Northern Irish people has not been listened to is that the new abortion provision also fails to listen to and fails to protect the dignity of women like the remarkable Heidi Crowder. Heidi is a young woman whose courageous campaigning on behalf of individuals like herself who have Down syndrome is provoking a great deal of soul searching. As she has observed, the new regulations governing abortion in Northern Ireland, and I quote, "tell people like me that I should not exist." She is a woman who has experienced harm because of what regulations like these say about the way our society views those with disabilities. And might I remind you at this point, for all the claims made that this regime was put in place to ensure abortion provision in Northern Ireland satisfies the requirements of the CEDAW committee, in fact, this new provision completely disregards its requirements that legislation must not perpetuate discrimination, which is the blatant effect of these regulations. They say if a baby is able-bodied, that it would be illegal to terminate them beyond 24 weeks gestation, but that if a baby has a non-fatal disability like Heidi, then they are not worthy of the same protection and can have their life taken from them at any time from point of viability until birth. That sends out the message loud and clear that the lives of those with non-fatal disabilities are worthy of less protection than those who are able-bodied. Abortion up to birth in cases of non-fatal disability is legal practice in GB, but their legislation was drawn up in 1990, and our attitudes, thankfully, towards disability has moved on. The Disability Rights Commission, now the Equality and Human Rights Commission, said this provision is offensive to many people. It reinforces negative stereotypes of disability and is incompatible with valuing disability and non-disability equally. I also must express my huge concern that, unlike in Great Britain, the law British MPs foisted on us affords no means of protecting women from coercive abortion. We have been made well aware during the COVID-19 pandemic that there has been a rising number of women experiencing harm in the very place that they should feel safe. Domestic abuse is not something we can ignore. And in 2019, The Independent reported on this particular topic and worryingly prevalent form of harm that 1 in 7 UK women had experienced reproductive coercion either to keep or abort a pregnancy. And our laws permit for this. We also see in Northern Ireland, the United Nations Population Fund State of World Population 2020 report estimates that there are more than 140 million missing women as a result of pre- and postnatal sex selection. This is a horrifying figure, more than twice the population of the entire UK, and is both an indictment in its own right, but also leads to devastating further abuses in the places where this is most prevalent. In Great Britain, in January of this year, the government reiterated that abortion on the basis of sex is illegal. But because abortion is only legal under the specific grounds provided by the Abortion Act 1967, none of which is that the baby would be the wrong sex. However, when parliamentarians forced the regulations on us from Westminster, they allowed for abortion up to 12 weeks for any reason. And now in Northern Ireland and right across the United Kingdom, we can actually determine the sex of your baby by 10 weeks. Therefore, opening this up to sex selection, something that is absolutely abhorrent in this day and age. Madam President, this House regrets that for 719 babies in Northern Ireland, they have been denied the right to life. The most basic human right surely is the right to life. And in all of this, both lives matters. We as a society have now more rights for cats, dogs, whales than we do the silent cry of the unborn child. And therefore, I will be supporting the proposition tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, for your speech. Thank you once again. And now we turn to the fourth speaker for the opposition here tonight, Councillor Áine Groogan. Thank you.
Thank you, President, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this debate this evening. I'm speaking tonight in firm opposition to this motion. Decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland just over a year ago was long overdue. The only thing that is regrettable about the situation is how long we had to wait. For too long, women and pregnant people in Northern Ireland, although part of the UK, were criminalised for seeking an abortion. Until June 2017, although paying our taxes like our sisters in England, Scotland and Wales, if we travelled within the UK to have an abortion, we could not do so on the NHS. It did not matter if the reason we needed an abortion was because of rape, incest, fetal abnormality, or that we simply could not and did not want to be pregnant. The law was so strict here that even in the handful of cases that fell within the exception, an abortion was denied because of the chilling effect on medical practitioners here. We were an anomaly, a problem that was ignored by the government at Westminster and in Northern Ireland for too long. We have a right to equality before the law too. Confession time. I was raised Catholic. I attended a Catholic maintained primary and grammar school, and to be honest, the most sex education we received was an embarrassed biology teacher pointing to a diagram of a vagina in a textbook, and of course the standard abstinence doctrine that was lectured at us. Somehow, despite that, by the time I got to university, I was very firmly pro-choice. Look, I did wrestle with it as a teenager. Catholic guilt definitely got into my head, and I did float around the teachings we received in school that abortion was wrong. But then life happened. I saw the reality of what happened when anti-choice positions were enshrined in law. It didn't matter what I, or anyone else for that matter, personally thought about making that choice. What we would do in that position. What mattered was ensuring that women and pregnant people were supported, were able to receive safe, free and timely access to reproductive health care. Anything else meant women suffered. Criminalising abortion did not stop abortions. Restricting access did not stop abortions. You either forced a woman to continue a pregnancy she did not want to continue, or you forced her on a boat. You either gave her options or gave her none, irrespective of her own circumstances. You either had laws that were compassionate, or you put women's health and lives at risk. I trusted women then, and I still do. I got involved with pro-choice activism while doing my undergraduate degree in Trinity in Dublin. I attended rallies and protests and was part of the campaign team that won the referendum to make Trinity a pro-choice student union, something I know Queen's Student Union also has as a position. I continued this activism when I moved to Belfast for my master's degree in gender, conflict and human rights. My dissertation looked at how the Northern Irish political conflict affected women's reproductive rights. For me, the legal situation in Northern Ireland on abortion didn't happen by accident. Women's rights in Northern Ireland were, and indeed continue to be, detrimentally impacted by the holy trinity of nationalism, hypermasculinity and religion, which operates together to create a dominant, moral, conservative socio-political culture that was accepted by, adopted by and institutionalised by the political structures here. Is it any wonder it took an English MP to step in and ensure that the UK were compliant with their international human rights obligations in Northern Ireland? I began working in 2017 for Claire Bailey, Green Party MLA for South Belfast, and joined the party at the same time. Reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights were the two main issues for me politically, and to be honest, not much has changed. I couldn't have joined any other party. We were the first to bring forward a motion of equal marriage to the Assembly. We supported decriminalisation long before it was on the political agenda, and Claire was a source of personal political inspiration for me. She's currently working on a private member's bill to introduce buffer zones around reproductive healthcare centres, an issue she has first-hand experience of after working as an escort at Mary Stopes. I've also been working as a counsellor to seek regulation of graphic anti-choice imagery that is employed by some groups around Belfast. You have a right to your opinion, you have a right to protest, and a right to advocate publicly for your viewpoint. But I do not see how harassing women and seeking to traumatise and re-traumatise women and children with imagery of questionable validity is a right. If you claim to care for women, please do better to challenge those in your own community who cross those lines. 1 in 3 women have had an abortion. Someone you love has had an abortion. Someone you love will have an abortion. When you stand and moralise about abortion, you should remember that this is not a hypothetical debate about ethics or morals. The words you say will hit someone you love like a gut punch. You're standing in judgment, even though you may claim not to be, but your words say differently, of the thousands of women who have an abortion. You're standing criticising a woman who made a choice based on their own lives, their own families, their own health. How dare you think you know what is right for that person? They do not need your judgment, they need your support. Honestly, I find it personally reprehensible that some still feel justified in imposing their own views on abortion on others. You're entirely entitled to hold your own view based on your beliefs. You're not entitled to hold others to the same. It is one thing to believe you would not choose to terminate a pregnancy, but it's something else entirely to believe that just because you wouldn't do so, no one else should be allowed to terminate a pregnancy, and indeed should be criminally sanctioned for doing so. Because that's, folks, that is what those here tonight arguing that decriminalised abortion is regrettable are saying. Don't let them fool you with claims to care both for the women and the unborn. They believe that women should be jailed, that doctors should be jailed. A decision to terminate a pregnancy is between a woman and the medical professionals that care for her. It is highly inappropriate in the 21st century for abortion provision to be governed by criminal law rather than healthcare regulations. And thankfully, I do believe that the majority of people in Northern Ireland agree. Opinion poll after opinion poll here has shown over the years that people did not agree with their laws. As is so often the case, the people in Northern Ireland were ahead of our politicians. For example, the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey in 2016 showed that 71% supported abortion to be treated as a healthcare issue rather than a criminal one. I have no doubt that a series of damning headlines as a result of restrictive abortion laws and concerted activism by Alliance for Choice and others contributed to the groundswell of public opinion around this issue. Remember Savita. The tragic death of Savita Halpinavar in a Galway hospital in 2012 after being told this was a Catholic country as her life slipped away awoke so many across these isles to the brutal reality of our abortion laws. So many mistakenly believed that you could access an abortion if your life was in danger here, even if you had been raped or there was a fetal abnormality. Many who considered themselves pro-life and in support of the laws did not even believe believe this position. But that was the facts. We've already mentioned Sarah Uritt tonight, another name that's familiar and a story that's familiar to all of us. Sarah was told that there was no prospect of her child surviving, and she faced the likelihood of a very traumatic birth. She was forced to leave the love and care of her family and friends behind to travel to England to end the pregnancy, as she was left with no choice here in Northern Ireland but to continue it. This was inhumane. April 2016, a woman in Northern Ireland was given a suspended sentence under legislation that was older than the light bulb for taking abortion pills she ordered online. Horrifyingly, it was her housemates that reported her to the police. International Women's Day 2017. Pro-choice activists across Northern Ireland saw their homes and workplaces raided by the PSNI. Many of us were at Belfast City Hall, a place I am pleased to say I'm now elected to as a proud pro-choice woman, listening to Angela Davis at the precise moment the police chose to act. The irony is not lost to me. Interesting timing, to say the least. Just last year, prosecution of a woman for procuring abortion pills for her 15-year-old daughter was ongoing until finally the law was amended and the case was dropped. This is just a handful of stories and headlines. There are many, many more people behind these stories. Criminalisation was not just a vague threat for us, but, and this is the crucial bit, it did not deter. Women and pregnant people need access to abortion. They always have, and they always will. 28 women a week travel to the rest of the UK. Many more access safe abortion pills online. All criminalisation did was export the problem. It drove it underground and it added to the shame and stigma that surrounded this issue. I know someone listening to this has had an abortion or may face a crisis pregnancy in the future. Please do not feel ashamed. There is help and support available to you legally and safely. You are what matters in this, not any of us sitting here preaching on one side or the other. Reach out to the likes of Informed Choices for counselling either pre or post-crisis pregnancies. If you do choose to have an abortion and you don't know where to turn, contact Alliance for Choice and someone will be there to guide you. Of course, access to abortion is only one element of reproductive justice. I would like to see more on the proponent's side tonight, fighting quite so hard for things like subsidised childcare, for adequate and supportive prenatal and antenatal care, for full paid maternal and paternal leave, for appropriate and comprehensive relationship and sex education for all young people, for better access to free contraception, for a welfare system that supported rather than punished people for having children, particularly single mothers. Some want to force women to give birth, but the care after that, it remains to be seen. Abortion was decriminalised on the 21st of October 2019, meaning that women, pregnant people and their healthcare providers will no longer be subject to archaic criminal sanctions. We still have some way to go to ensure adequate access is provided across the region. But rest assured, activists will not stop until every woman and pregnant person has access to free, safe, local and legal abortion if and when they need it. Abortion is healthcare. It is not a crime. Please remember that that is what this motion is saying. I should not be criminalised for seeking access to abortion services. My doctor should not be criminalised for providing me with my healthcare options. And I will not wait any longer for human rights compliant legislation. I urge you to vote against this motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Áine, for that speech, and thank you for contributing to our debate tonight. Thank you once again. And now I introduce finally our student speakers once again. Our student speaker to close the case for the proposition, Mark Gilmore. Thank you.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be in the presence of such esteemed speakers tonight. This debate obviously is all about choice. It's about agency. It's a shame that the people of Northern Ireland did not get that choice. As was already pointed out, 5% of the electorate believe that abortion should not be available up to 24 weeks as it currently is under this law. However, tonight I'll be speaking about something a bit different. I'll be speaking about the personhood of the unborn child, because that is an argument that we have yet to see any interaction from the opposition on tonight. So I'll be speaking about the fact that personhood is not developmental. You do not become more of a person as you grow older. Personhood is not conditional. It is not impaired by disability. It does not matter your influence or level of dependence, and personhood cannot be taken away. It does not waver how you are valued by the people around you. So the proposition can indeed understand greatly the incredibly difficult position that many women find themselves in. It is what makes this debate so contentious. It is what makes it so difficult to talk about. However, what we've seen from the opposition tonight is we've seen this libertarian argument. This argument of you can hold your beliefs, right, but it is completely immoral to force those beliefs on others. However, I don't find this argument to hold ground. I am a libertarian Christian. I don't believe that forced religion is religion. However, when it comes down to it, if you thoroughly believe, if you actually believe that the unborn child is a life as valuable as each of our own, then you cannot sit idly by and see that life be taken. It is akin to watching murder go uncriminalized. So the libertarian argument does not hold water. So when we're convicting someone, we have this threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think this threshold can come into play in this debate. If you can prove to me beyond a reasonable doubt that an unborn child is not alive, then I will cross over to the other side of the house and I will say, I am really sorry. I've done you a tremendous wrong, and I will become a passionate pro-choice voice. However, if you can't do that, then you have to seriously examine your conscience of whether an unborn child is in fact alive. If there's even a 10% chance that can completely revolutionize how we think about abortion. This analogy might seem a bit crude. It's just what I'm coming up with now. Say you were to press a button, and that button could give you a chance of winning £1 million, right? But there's a 10% chance that button will take the life of another. Let's say take the life of one of us here. Would any of us press it? No, we wouldn't press it, because we know that would be deeply irresponsible. We know that would be playing with life itself. So I want to invite you tonight, if you haven't considered the fact that an unborn child may even be alive, if you haven't even considered 10%, then I invite you to do so tonight. So I believe, and the proposition believe, that the hallmark of a society is how it treats its most, is not how it treats its most successful, but how it treats its most vulnerable. The question of abortion is so important to our understanding of human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the chairperson of the Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration. She said, "Where after all do human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world." The right to life is not a qualified right. It is absolute. And if we do not extend it to every group, then it damages the right to life for everyone and begins the gradual unraveling of our concept of universal human rights, as Peadar Tóibín rightly pointed out. By delegitimizing the humanity of groups throughout history, we've been able to commit atrocities seemingly in good conscience. It's perfectly acceptable to carry out the mass slaughter of 6 million Jews because they're not really people. It's perfectly acceptable to have an entire race thrown into servitude because, well, they're only 3/5 of a person. A person is either a person or not. That is my first point. Personhood is not developmental. It doesn't develop. And obviously, if you don't believe that an unborn child is a person, there is nothing to say that it has any value whatsoever. And in that regard, we can certainly justify our decisions there. However, if an unborn child is a person, it changes everything. So I'm going to, first of all, present some scientific evidence. What is our evidence for this personhood? Well, firstly, I think an important question is whether a fetus can feel pain. I think this is important to personhood. Recent studies have shown that a fetus can feel pain in an unborn child up to 12 weeks. And a recent study just out last year has shown that the reflex response actually comes as early as 7.5 weeks. This is an important condition around personhood, because while we fight the personhood of animals, we often say an animal's personhood is defined by their ability to feel pain. And that is the chief argument surrounding legal animal personhood today. But we seemingly are unable to extend it to children. Secondly, I had a bit of a metaphysical, philosophical point. So we're faced with a bit of a moral problem if we define personhood to be much more than the ability to reason, to speak, or develop a defined sense of self. If we define it as this, then infants cannot be persons. In fact, much of any semblance to personhood, if you define it as this, you don't have until you're a toddler. So if you were to be in any way consistent, you would have to justify infanticide with this definition of personhood. The only thing that separates an unborn child from ourselves is time. We do not become more of a person as we grow older. It is time that many use to justify this stripping of personhood from the unborn child. So we have to acknowledge that an unborn child is alive. For how far can we stretch this suspension of personhood? If somebody goes into a coma, does that strip them of their personhood because they are unable to reason or be conscious? If you sleep at night, does that strip you of your personhood because you are unable to reason or be conscious? How do we justify these things if we define personhood in this way? Pro-choice activists will claim that the point of personhood is the point to which an unborn child can exist separately from their mother. Unfortunately, this is a completely self-defeating argument. A newborn child cannot exist separately from their mother or any paternal figure, and are entirely reliant upon a mother way into childhood. Thirdly, I'd like to look quickly at eugenics and abortion. We are increasingly seeing Down syndrome, unborn children being aborted at astronomical rates. 9 out of 10 Down syndrome babies who are diagnosed will be aborted. Carla Lockhart has already brought up Heidi Crowder, who says that she feels like less of a person under the eyes of the law because of this provision. It is state-sanctioned eugenics, and it will drastically affect the disabled community in this region. So I'd like to just summarize my points. The only distinction between us and the unborn is time. The ability to feel pain is evidence that personhood is present. And we must define personhood to be the potential, if we are in any way to be consistent with our values and understanding of a person after they are born. So I beg the House to propose this motion and to join with me in saying, in the words of Dr. Seuss, a person is a person, no matter how small. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Your speech, your contribution to our debate. So now it turns to the last speaker of the debate, but certainly not the least, Mr. Conor McArdle, joining us all the way from Brussels. So thank you, Conor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and a big thank you to everybody in the council who's worked so hard to put this together, and thank you to all my fellow speakers as well. You know, debates like this don't just happen, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. You know, I want to make it very clear that this debate matters tonight. You know, these issues are incredibly fluid. They don't go away. The repeal, the 8th referendum, will be reviewed in a year's time. The legislation from that and abortion services in the North have not been fully implemented. Now, listen, there's been a lot of commentary about human rights tonight, and human rights naturally is controversial. Human rights are complicated. If it was simple, I would have spent the last year doing nothing while studying it. It's a very complex area where people can find different things to support different points of view. Now, I'm going to go through the human rights issues that face abortion law, both North and South. The director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, stated that international human rights law should be seen as a law of last resort when domestic rights legislation fails. Domestic rights legislation failed women both North and South in Ireland, in preventing them from accessing abortion and criminalising those who did for decades. Ireland had a number of legislative implementations that prevented women from accessing. Yeah, go on, Peadar.
Is your right to life a human right?
Yeah, under the treaty and convention it is, yes.
Do you believe all human beings are equal?
Yes, naturally.
Do you believe an unborn child is a human being?
No back and forth, please, Conor. Continue.
Just remember that last question.
I'll come on to Peadar.
Okay.
I'll come on to Peadar's point. Like I will, and like as I stated, you can find a quote to suit naturally what you believe in your opinion. But as the tide of Western democracies began to turn towards liberalisation of abortion law, with the Abortion Act 1967 in the UK, Roe versus Wade in 73, this island in the north of the Atlantic remained resolute against any reform of abortive legislation. The island may have been divided politically, but was united in its regressive approach towards women's reproductive rights. There is no direct treaty reference to abortion. However, human rights treaties and protocols offer a scope for interpretation through case law, which is illustrated below, has major effects on domestic legislation. In the case of A, B and C, Ireland 2010, the judgment was highly critical of Irish state's abortion laws, describing it as having a significant chilling effect. The fallout from this case, combined with the tragic already mentioned death of Safida Halappanavar in 2012, created the necessary political climate in Ireland to move towards the liberalisation of our restrictive abortion laws. This led to the creation of the Citizens' Assembly and gave the Irish government the confidence that a repeal of the 8th Amendment was possible. This momentum was furthered by the case of Mellett versus Ireland 2016, where Irish abortion laws were deemed incompatible with Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the UN stated that the actions of the Irish state amounted to cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment in violation of Article 7. The Irish state had forced Miss Mellett to travel to have an abortion due to a fatal fetal abnormality of her unborn child, rather than allowing her to have the procedure at home in Ireland. On the 26th of May 2018, the Republic of Ireland repealed its 8th Amendment by popular vote, as demonstrated by the 67% of overwhelming support from the public voting yes. Now that is a real democratic will of the people. However, an hour's drive up the road from the County Centre in Dublin, north of the border, women were still being subjected to abortion laws from the 1800s. There has been a number of domestic challenges and case law to the restrictive abortion laws in the north. However, Ceri Dingle, represented by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, was the first to challenge directly on the grounds of human rights. It is, however, bittersweet that by the time Ceri Dingle finally received a judgment in October last year, the law was already on its way to being changed by Westminster. Mrs. Justice Keegan stated that there was no need to declare incompatibility in regards to the impending legislation that was due to come into force. The reform of abortion law in Ireland happened due to pressure from judicial decisions in human rights law cases, combined with the human rights law sources such as protocols and established treaties, and indeed just cogents, i.e. the norms of international law. And while these cases are naturally not the only factor contributing to the change in case law and indeed the legislation in Northern Ireland, they have been the clearest legal expression of the devastating real-life cost that these laws have had on women, and the clearest illustration of why the law had to be changed. These women were not activists, but simply people denied their human rights. Ceri simply describes herself as the voice that spoke out. Now, as I said, human rights law is only one part of the debate, and indeed is a contentious part of the debate.
On that point?
No, thank you. I want to acknowledge, first of all, my incredible privilege as a white man here today, as someone who often has the privilege not to think about this issue, namely a privilege of willful ignorance that has been offered to us before these laws were repealed. And that is basically what the proposition is offering to you tonight, to go back to the days of ignorance, to the days of disregarding the hard cases that we don't want to talk about. Now, nobody says abortion is a good thing. Nobody in the opposition tonight is saying that. And no woman demands an abortion. Women need an abortion. And the proposition fails ultimately on two key areas, a pragmatic and compassionate approach. In terms of pragmatism, abortion was and is happening all across Ireland. It was happening before the repeal of the 8th and was happening before Westminster imposed legislation in the north. It was happening unsafely, with pills being bought across the internet, and it was happening by thousands and countless of women taking the boat to England or getting a cheap Ryanair flight over to Manchester or Liverpool or any other city across the water that was offering them services. And this is where the failure of the proposition to acknowledge the pragmatism here completely undermines their argument. How many women were denied the opportunity to access healthcare in their own country, to access healthcare with their natural support units around them at home, and were forced to make that very lonely trip, checking in a boarding gate at 6:30 in the morning in Dublin Airport, feeling the loneliest place in the world, to fly over to England for a medical procedure. You know, and I think Peadar talks about being a left-wing TD, but I mean, like, naturally, the laws in the Republic of Ireland before the repeal of the 8th disproportionately affected working class women, many of them who couldn't afford to travel to England. And this pragmatism for too long has perpetuated this myth of a holier than thou island, north and south, all the while treating women ultimately as second-class citizens. From the laundries to the 8th to the North's outright refusal to acknowledge the 1967 Act, ways were found ultimately to legislate for this privilege of ignorance, which they could employ. And the hard cases have been talked about tonight. And we do accept the facts say they make up a small percentage of the cases north and south, but they still make up a percentage. They still happen. The tragic death of Savita Halapanova, no thank you. The tragic death of Savita illustrated that. The X case. And just last year in the north, a 12-year-old victim of rape had to travel to England for an abortion. I discussed the Mallet case earlier in the brief section about human rights law. And this is where compassion has to be shown. Pragmatic compassion. This pragmatism is interwoven with this compassion to acknowledge a woman's right to choose is her own and not that of the state. We cannot impose these beliefs on others. We cannot impose these laws that have caused so much harm and so much fundamental devastation across this island. We cannot do that anymore. The proposition's legislative desires brings us back to the 1800s. We should not regret the implementation of the legislation in the North. However, we should regret the manner in which it was brought in. It is a tragic failure of our democratic system under devolution that we did not legislate for this earlier. And there has been mentions of the faults and the failings of the legislation, which is a fair enough point to make, because you cannot copy and paste legislation under devolution, but you cannot deny its ultimate implementation. And this is what happens when Westminster eventually said enough is enough and put it straight into law in the North. And to engage in a little bit of rebuttal from the proposition side, Ben talked about adoption. Adoption is not a solution to abortion. I'm sorry, that is a fallacy. Anne talked about Northern Ireland should not be told what to do. Well, Anne has been a cheerleader for Brexit for the past 4 years, which is ultimately be telling us what to do. Carla talked about the failure of devolution. the DUP's a la carte approach to devolution has been very, very clearly highlighted, and there's no need for me to go into it overly heavily. You know, and listen, this is an incredibly complex, divisive, and very important topic. But I want to say something very clearly. It should, of course, in the first instance, be debated. And that is incredibly important. Because if you outright ignore, if you outright do not engage, you fail to find any way to move forward. And ultimately, what we are trying to do here is make women's lives better. We should do that by engaging in appropriate debate, by engaging with the facts, and engaging with an element of pragmatism, which we need to apply here. Abortion is happening. It will happen. We should make it at least that the best thing we can do is alleviate the suffering of women, illustrate compassion, and ultimately accept and celebrate that we are not where we used to be a number of years ago. Thank you very much. I urge you to reject the proposition's argument tonight.
Thank you, Conor, for your speech. Now, as a student society, we are focused on empowering our students to ask the people in charge of our cultural progression and the way that our society runs questions. And therefore, during the entirety of this debate, questions have been fed into this iPad that I've got right in front of me now. And if that's okay with speakers, we'll go through a quick fire questions. If speakers could be very short in their answers so we could get through as many as possible, that would be very appreciated. So thank you. So the first question I have is a question directed to Anne Widdecombe. This is from Jasmine Thompson. Jasmine says, a significant part of your rhetoric focuses on the idea of freedom and, to quote comments made in the European Parliament in the context of Brexit, liberty of the oppressed. In this context, is it not inconsistent to argue that the state should force women to carry a fetus to term against their preference? In your view, is the freedom of the state more important than that of the individual? Oh, sorry, Anne, I think you're muted at the moment.
That one. Can you hear me now?
That's brilliant. Thank you, Anne.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not technologically brilliant. The life of the unborn child is more important than the liberty of the woman to kill it.
Thank
you asked me to be brief.
Thank you, Anne. A question to Jodie Morrow from Layla Dalkic. Could she state what happens during an abortion instead of hiding behind euphemisms like terminating a pregnancy?
I don't feel like I'm the best person to answer this question because I'm not a medical professional and I've never had an abortion, so I don't personally know. So I don't feel comfortable answering that.
Sorry, I will go to Anne Furedi, if you could comment on that question, perhaps.
Sure. I don't feel the need to use euphemisms at all. An abortion is about ending a pregnancy, and that involves ending the life of the embryo or the fetus. And a good abortion is an abortion that does it in the most effective and problem-free way for the woman who is having that medical procedure. I think that we should be very clear about exactly what it involves, because we never want a woman to go into the procedure in any way confused about what it involves.
Thank you. Question to Peadar Tóibín from Cormac. Your party has contested a number of elections, north and south, and has only managed to win a very small proportion of the vote. Why can't you accept the vast democratic mandate to decriminalise abortion and enable women to exercise control over their own bodies?
Thanks for that. And just I might have to go soon. There's another vote coming up here, just to let you know. But well, first of all, our party is 20 months old and already has achieved over 50,000 votes, or over 2% of the vote, who are polling roughly the same as parties as big as the Greens, People Before Profit, and the Labour Party in the south. So actually, the growth of our movement has been incredibly fast in that period of time. And just in relation to it was mentioned earlier that this is about the freedom of women, but can the freedom of anybody be on the basis of the death of another person? And that's the key. If my freedom is on the basis of, as Anne said, and Furedi, and I think Anne Furedi's very honest, at least in this, if my freedom is on the basis of a person's life is ended, that's not freedom, and that's not a humanity that I want to be involved in. Abortion is about opposing your view on other people, so much so that it costs the life of the other individual. And the question I asked there in relation to the last speaker, is your life a human right? And if you say to yourself, yeah, my life is a human right, well then why deny it from another person? We need to have equality in this society, and abortion is built on inequality.
Thank you. Question now to Carla Lockhart MP from Lauren O'Neill. As a representative of Northern Ireland, and not just yourself, if there had been a referendum on abortion in NI where an overwhelming majority voted for abortion to be legalised, would you put your own beliefs aside and encourage your party to work to implement the will of the people, regardless of their politics, in the name of democracy?
Well, I think from the very name of our party, Democratic Unionist Parties, I'm a Democrat, and I recognise that democracy does rule. However, that doesn't stop me as an individual trying to ensure, and as a party, ensuring that services are there to help people choose life, and to actually ensure that if they are told that that their baby has a life-limiting condition or a fatal abnormality, that there's a support there to actually help them carry that baby to term and to give it dignity in death. So in my mind, it's all about putting in services to really help and support those who find themselves in a crisis pregnancy. So I'm not someone who sits here and says, abortion is wrong, but I'm not prepared to put solutions in place. And certainly from our party's perspective, that's what we want to see going forward.
Thank you. And the final question of the night, question to Áine Groogan from Leah Boyle. In an interview with the BBC, abortion provider Dr. Leroy Carhart stated, "The baby has no input in this as far as I'm concerned. I think that it is a baby and I use it with the patients. I have no problem killing the baby if it's inside the mother's uterus. If abortion providers are even admitting that they kill babies during abortions, why will the pro-abortion lobby not concede this? And if we agree that abortion kills babies, how can we possibly permit this to occur without a criminal penalty?"
Look, as I said in my speech, we can sit and we can moralise and we can look at terminology and language used. I'm quite similar to Anne Furedi here in terms of, I'd be blunt about it as well. But it comes down to whether or not you think a woman should be sanctioned, should risk life imprisonment, because that is what the law here said beforehand, for having an abortion. That's the reality. And I have yet to hear anyone from the proponent side tonight say that they're comfortable with a woman going to jail for having an abortion or having their doctors go to jail. So that's what it comes down to for me when we talk about decriminalisation. And I think, honestly, that's what's swung it for a lot of people. I've had conversations with people that would consider themselves personally pro-life, but they understand that a law that seeks to put a woman in jail for what we all acknowledge is a very difficult decision. It's not something you wake up in the morning and flippantly decide to have an abortion. Is wrong. It is wrong to send a woman to jail for exercising her right to choose. And that's what it comes down to for me.
Thank you. And we've actually had one more question just come in now. And this question is directed to Conor McArdle, and this is from Sarah McAllister. Given that NI abortion law now permits abortion up until birth for children with Down syndrome, does it not appear that the law supports eugenics?
Thanks for the question. I think the very harsh element of the 1967 Act illustrates the failure of Stormont to legislate for this property, to take into those considerations. Like the law in the Republic of Ireland does not legislate for that. And I'm a proponent of the law in the Republic of Ireland. So I think the elements of the 1967 Act that we do not agree with here in the North that have been implemented are a clear failure of the devolved institutions to work to find a workable abortion solution to the North, rather than outright rejection, which ultimately resulted in the blanket implementation of the 1967 Act. So this is a very clear illustration of the failure of the devolved assemblies to do that. And you noted when the Republic went through the democratic system, when had a conversation about the issue, had a referendum, and ultimately had legislation, this was not legislated for. So I think that that's illustrative of the need to have a sensible, pragmatic political conversation about this, and not to constantly block and put it away for another time, because it's a real issue affecting thousands of women across this island.
Now it turns to me to finally thank every one of you who has tuned in and watched this debate on our Facebook for joining us and engaging with us tonight, and to all our speakers. That includes Ben Cavan, Jodie Morrow, the Right Honourable Anne Widdecombe, Anne Furedi, Peadar Tóibín TD, Ceri Dingle, Carla Lockhart MP, Councillor Áine Groogan, Mark Gilmore, and last but not least, Conor McArdle. So thank you all for coming. We are very grateful that you were here tonight with us virtually, and we hope to see you all again soon in person where we can. So thank you for coming. Thanks for tuning on Facebook, and good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.